Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Meet Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student burdened with debt, struggling through his final year of school. Between studying for exams, working a part-time job, and dealing with the bills left behind by his late father, Mark couldn't see a way out. Life seemed like a constant uphill battle, with every step more challenging than the last. He was starting to lose hope when a mysterious phone call changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was smooth, calm, and decisive. It was Eleanor Brooks, a 71-year-old billionaire with a reputation for being both ruthless and brilliant in business. Her voice crackled through the phone, offering him a solution that sounded too good to be true. "Mr. Davis, I know about your financial situation, and I believe I can help you," she said. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 o'clock p.m. We'll discuss the details." Mark was taken aback. How did she know about his debts? How could someone like her possibly help him? He had never met her in person, and yet here she was, offering him a lifeline. That evening, Mark arrived at the bistro, his mind racing with questions. The rain poured down, drenching his clothes as he made his way through the entrance. He stepped inside, greeted by the warm, golden glow of the restaurant. He was ushered to a corner table where Eleanor was already waiting. She looked every bit the powerful businesswoman he had imagined: silver hair, impeccable suit, and a calm, commanding presence. "Mr. Davis," she said, her tone as cool as the evening air. "Please, sit. I have a proposal for you." Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He had no idea what he was walking into, but his curiosity pushed him forward. "I'm offering you a business arrangement," Eleanor continued, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "I will pay off all your debts, secure your future, and provide you with a comfortable life. In return, I want you to marry me." She paused, letting the words sink in. Mark blinked, stunned. Marry her? He had to be hearing things. Eleanor was a wealthy, powerful woman, and he was a broke law student with nothing to offer. But she wasn't looking for love. This was a contract, a business deal. Eleanor needed a companion to help solidify her legacy and protect her estate from complications with her family. She wasn't asking for romance, just a willing participant in a marriage of convenience. "I know this sounds absurd, but think about it," Eleanor said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I need someone who can help secure my future, and you need someone who can secure yours. We both stand to gain." Mark sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He was desperate. He had no way to pay off his mounting debts, no way to save his family from financial ruin. But this was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. If he agreed, he would have the financial stability he had always dreamed of. But the thought of marrying someone he barely knew, someone so much older, felt strange. Still, he couldn't deny the practicality of the offer. "I need some time to think," Mark said, his voice low. Eleanor simply nodded. "Of course. But do not take too long. This offer won't last forever." And with that, the deal was set. As Mark left the bistro, the rain had stopped, but the storm in his mind raged on. He had agreed to marry a woman he didn't know, but in return, he would receive everything he had ever wanted: financial freedom, security, and a life without the constant weight of debt on his shoulders. The question now was, could he live with the consequences of this decision? Could he marry for money, knowing that love would never be part of the equation? What Mark didn't realize was that this agreement would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated. This wasn't just a business deal, it was the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and what it means to truly be free. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Meet Mark Davis, a 23-year-old law student burdened with debt, struggling through his final year of school. Between studying for exams, working a part-time job, and dealing with the bills left behind by his late father, Mark couldn't see a way out. Life seemed like a constant uphill battle, with every step more challenging than the last. He was starting to lose hope when a mysterious phone call changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was smooth, calm, and decisive. It was Eleanor Brooks, a 71-year-old billionaire with a reputation for being both ruthless and brilliant in business. Her voice crackled through the phone, offering him a solution that sounded too good to be true. "Mr. Davis, I know about your financial situation, and I believe I can help you," she said. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. We'll discuss the details." Mark was taken aback. How did she know about his debts? How could someone like her possibly help him? He had never met her in person, and yet here she was, offering him a lifeline. That evening, Mark arrived at the bistro, his mind racing with questions. The rain poured down, drenching his clothes as he made his way through the entrance. He stepped inside, greeted by the warm, golden glow of the restaurant. He was ushered to a corner table where Eleanor was already waiting. She looked every bit the powerful businesswoman he had imagined: silver hair, impeccable suit, and a calm, commanding presence. "Mr. Davis," she said, her tone as cool as the evening air. "Please, sit. I have a proposal for you." Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He had no idea what he was walking into, but his curiosity pushed him forward. "I'm offering you a business arrangement," Eleanor continued, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "I will pay off all your debts, secure your future, and provide you with a comfortable life. In return, I want you to marry me." She paused, letting the words sink in. Mark blinked, stunned. Marry her? He had to be hearing things. Eleanor was a wealthy, powerful woman, and he was a broke law student with nothing to offer. But she wasn't looking for love. This was a contract, a business deal. Eleanor needed a companion to help solidify her legacy and protect her estate from complications with her family. She wasn't asking for romance, just a willing participant in a marriage of convenience. "I know this sounds absurd, but think about it," Eleanor said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I need someone who can help secure my future, and you need someone who can secure yours. We both stand to gain." Mark sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He was desperate. He had no way to pay off his mounting debts, no way to save his family from financial ruin. But this was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. If he agreed, he would have the financial stability he had always dreamed of. But the thought of marrying someone he barely knew, someone so much older, felt strange. Still, he couldn't deny the practicality of the offer. "I need some time to think," Mark said, his voice low. Eleanor simply nodded. "Of course. But do not take too long. This offer won't last forever." And with that, the deal was set. As Mark left the bistro, the rain had stopped, but the storm in his mind raged on. He had agreed to marry a woman he didn't know, but in return, he would receive everything he had ever wanted: financial freedom, security, and a life without the constant weight of debt on his shoulders. The question now was, could he live with the consequences of this decision? Could he marry for money, knowing that love would never be part of the equation? What Mark didn't realize was that this agreement would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated. This wasn't just a business deal, it was the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and what it means to truly be free. Mark spent the entire night tossing and turning in bed. The rain outside had stopped, but inside his mind, the storm was only beginning. He had always prided himself on his independence, but now, faced with the decision of marrying a stranger for money, his sense of pride was wavering. Eleanor's proposition was everything he needed: financial security, a stable future, and a way out of the mess his life had become. But could he really go through with it? Could he marry a woman he barely knew, simply for the sake of survival? As the clock ticked away, Mark knew that time was running out. He had to make a decision. By the time the sun rose, he had made up his mind. At 7 p.m. that evening, Mark stood outside Brooks Bistro once again, the same place where he had first met Eleanor. His palms were sweating, and his heart was racing as he looked up at the grand entrance. He had never been inside a place like this before. Everything about it screamed wealth and exclusivity. He took a deep breath and walked inside, trying to calm the nerves that were threatening to overwhelm him. Eleanor was already waiting at their usual corner table, her silver hair gleaming in the warm light of the bistro. She looked as poised and composed as ever, her sharp eyes steadying him as he approached. She gestured for him to sit down, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice calm and controlled. "I'm glad you decided to come back. I take it you've had time to think about my offer?" Mark sat down, feeling a lump form in his throat. He nodded slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've thought about it, and I'm willing to accept your proposal." Eleanor's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She already knew his answer. She had expected nothing less. "Good," she said simply. "Then let's get to the details." For the next hour, they went over the terms of their agreement. Eleanor outlined everything. The marriage would be formalized in a quiet ceremony with no public fanfare. It would be a legal contract, and Mark's role would be strictly to provide the appearance of a happy, stable marriage. There would be no romantic expectations, no emotional ties. It would be a union of convenience, a way to protect Eleanor's legacy and ensure that her wealth and assets were secure. Mark listened carefully, his mind trying to process all of the information. It was surreal, sitting across from this powerful woman, signing away his independence for the sake of a future he wasn't sure he even wanted. But the reality of his situation was clear. Without this deal, he would be stuck in debt forever. His dreams of becoming a lawyer would remain just that, dreams. "So, when does this all begin?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's smile widened as she slid a contract across the table to him. "The sooner the better," she replied. "Once you sign this, you'll be legally bound to the agreement. We'll announce it to the public in a few weeks, but for now, we'll keep things private." Mark glanced at the contract, his fingers hovering over the pen. For a moment, he hesitated. But then he remembered the pile of bills waiting for him at home, the calls from creditors that were becoming harder and harder to ignore. This was his chance, his only chance to escape the chaos of his life. With a deep breath, he signed the contract. It was official. He was now bound to Eleanor Brooks, not by love, but by necessity. And as he signed, a strange weight lifted off his shoulders. The uncertainty that had plagued him for so long seemed to fade away, replaced by the cold, calculated security of the decision he had just made. "It's done," Eleanor said, looking at the contract with satisfaction. "Now, Mr. Davis, we begin our new life together." Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Mark felt something shift. It wasn't love, but there was something in her gaze that made him wonder if this arrangement could be more than just a business deal. As they stood up to leave, Eleanor handed Mark a key to her penthouse, her expression softening ever so slightly. "This will be your home now," she said. "And soon, it will be our home." The words felt odd to him, but he couldn't deny the comfort that came with the promise of security. Maybe this wouldn't be as bad as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make this work. Mark stepped into the elevator with Eleanor, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. This was just the beginning, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had some control over his future. And as the doors of the elevator closed, he couldn't help but wonder, would this arrangement stay as cold and calculated as it seemed, or would something unexpected, something real begin to grow between them? It had been 2 weeks since Mark signed the contract, and everything had changed. His life, once filled with uncertainty and debt, was now surrounded by the luxury of Eleanor's world. He moved into the penthouse, a sleek, modern apartment overlooking the city skyline, a place he never thought he'd step foot in. Eleanor had kept her word, was living a life of comfort, without the constant pressure of bills and debt. But something was missing. It wasn't the material wealth that bothered him. It was the emptiness. He was living with Eleanor, yes, but they were still strangers in many ways, bound together by a contract, not love. Mark spent his days in silence, adjusting to the strange dynamic of their arrangement. They hardly spoke when they were in the same room. Their interactions were polite, cordial, but distant. Eleanor, while kind and efficient, was a businesswoman first, and Mark was just the man she needed to fulfill a role. There were no late-night conversations, no personal moments. Mark had agreed to this arrangement with his eyes wide open, but there were times when he found himself questioning it. Was this really the life he wanted? One evening, Mark sat alone in the penthouse, staring out at the city lights below. The silence felt suffocating. Eleanor was away at a charity gala, a regular event she attended, leaving him to his thoughts. He had yet to step foot into her world fully. The media, the high society, the charity events had all felt like a separate universe he didn't belong to. He had never felt more like an outsider. As he was lost in thought, the door opened. Eleanor stepped in, her gown shimmering as she walked into the room. She looked every bit the powerful, poised woman he had signed a contract with. But tonight, there was something different about her. She wasn't the icy businesswoman she usually was. She seemed tired, almost vulnerable. Mark stood up when she entered, his mind racing, unsure of what to say. "How was the gala?" Mark asked, his voice breaking the silence. "It was fine," Eleanor replied, her voice quieter than usual. "But I could do without all the pretense." They stood there for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Mark was about to speak again when Eleanor turned to face him. Her expression was softer now, more human. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "But sometimes, I feel so alone. I don't even know why I asked you to do this. Maybe because I needed someone, anyone, to fill the emptiness." She paused, as if unsure of how much to reveal. "But it's not working. Nothing feels real anymore." Mark's heart beat faster, a mix of confusion and empathy rising within him. He had expected her to be unshakable, untouchable, but here she was, revealing a side of herself he hadn't seen before. He found himself taking a step closer. "I didn't sign up for any of this either," Mark said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He realized the words felt real as they left his mouth. There was something genuine about them, even though their situation was anything but genuine. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe understanding. Mark didn't know, but he could see that the walls she had built around herself were starting to crack. For a moment, he forgot about the contract, forgot about the money, and saw her as just a woman who had been through her own struggles. "Thank you," she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I didn't expect you to say that." The air between them shifted, and Mark wasn't sure what to make of it. The contract they had signed was clear, but this new, unspoken connection felt different. There was something in the way Eleanor looked at him, something he hadn't seen before. Was it vulnerability? Was it a hint of something more? Mark didn't have the answers, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe, just maybe, this arrangement could become something more than what it started as. It wasn't love yet, but it was a step forward. And maybe that was enough for now. As Eleanor turned to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. "Good night, Mark," she said softly. There was no formality in her voice, no business tone, just two people sharing a moment of honesty. Mark nodded, watching as she disappeared down the hall. He stood there, his thoughts swirling. Was this the beginning of something new? Or just a fleeting moment in their complicated arrangement? Only time would tell. The next few days were quiet, but an unspoken tension lingered between Mark and Eleanor. Though they continued their daily routines, something had shifted in their dynamic. Mark found himself thinking about their conversation more often than he expected. Eleanor's vulnerability, her admission of loneliness, had stayed with him. He wasn't sure what to do with it, but he couldn't deny that it made him view their arrangement in a different light. As the week went on, Eleanor became more distant again, slipping back into the cold, businesslike persona that Mark had come to know. It was as if the brief moment of connection they had shared was a rare crack in her armor, quickly filled in by the walls she had built over years of being in control. Mark wasn't sure if he was just imagining things, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was avoiding him. They still lived together, but it was like they were strangers again, sharing the same space but not truly connecting. Mark decided to focus on his work, throwing himself into his studies and responsibilities around the penthouse. He didn't know how to navigate the complicated emotions that had started to stir inside him. But as he found himself walking through the sleek, silent halls of their shared home, something unexpected happened. It was a Thursday evening when Mark received a text from Eleanor, asking if he would join her at a business event she had to attend that night. She hadn't asked him to accompany her to anything like this before, and the sudden invitation caught him off guard. His first instinct was to decline. He was never one for social events, and the thought of stepping into her world made him feel out of place. But something made him reconsider. Maybe this would be his chance to truly see who Eleanor was outside the walls of the penthouse. Maybe he could figure out whether there was a real connection between them, or if they were always going to be just two people bound by contract. He texted her back a simple "I'll be there," and an hour later, he was standing in front of the entrance to an exclusive gala. The building was a massive, sparkling structure, full of luxury cars parked out front and people in expensive tuxedos and gowns stepping out of sleek vehicles. Mark felt like he had just stepped into a different world, one where he didn't belong. As he walked through the doors, the music and chatter of high society surrounded him, and he suddenly felt like an intruder. But Eleanor was already inside, her presence commanding the room. She stood at the center of a group of people, engaging in conversation with a confidence that Mark could only admire. She wore a stunning black dress, her silver hair swept up in an elegant updo. She was a woman who had mastered the art of controlling every situation, and for a moment, Mark found himself wondering if he would ever truly get to know her beyond the contract. He made his way through the crowd, and when Eleanor noticed him, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to signal to him that he had made the right choice in coming. As he approached her, Eleanor introduced him to several influential figures in the business world, each one nodding politely to him but not offering much more. Mark couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. But despite his discomfort, there was something strangely liberating about being in this world, even if it was just for a night. As the evening went on, Mark found himself standing in a quiet corner of the room, looking out at the city skyline. He had a drink in his hand, but it didn't do much to calm his nerves. He was used to the solitude of his apartment and the quietness of his life before all of this, but here, in this world, everything was fast, glamorous, and a bit overwhelming. Then Eleanor joined him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, her gaze focused on the city below. They both stood in silence, the hum of the event buzzing around them. It felt like the world had paused for a moment, and for the first time in a long while, Mark didn't feel like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. "This is all so much," Mark said after a while, breaking the silence. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes softening just a little. "I know," she said quietly. "But it's my life. It's how I've built everything I have." Mark nodded, understanding more than she knew. "It's not what I'm used to," he said. "But I'm starting to see why you do it." Eleanor's lips curled into a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't need to explain myself to you, Mark," she replied, but her tone wasn't cold, it was something else, something almost vulnerable. "But thank you for coming tonight." They stood there for a few moments longer, the city lights flickering in the distance. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, something beyond the contract they had signed. Mark wasn't sure where things were heading, but in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was something real starting to grow between them. It wasn't love, but it was something they both needed. As the night went on, the gala began to wind down, and Mark found himself feeling a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace he had expected when he agreed to this arrangement. But it was enough for now. The weeks passed, and the tension between Mark and Eleanor began to shift. They were no longer complete strangers, yet they were still bound by the terms of their contract. Eleanor remained the powerful businesswoman she had always been, but Mark had started to see a different side of her. Little by little, she let her guard down in his presence, though not entirely. Mark, in turn, began to understand more about her, not just as a billionaire, but as a woman who had built her empire with her own hands and had been through more than anyone could imagine. One afternoon, Mark returned home after a long day of studying. The penthouse felt strangely empty. The air was thick with silence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. He walked through the door, expecting to find Eleanor, but instead, the only sound that greeted him was the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. He checked the living room and then the kitchen. No sign of her. He texted her, asking where she was, but there was no immediate response. It wasn't like Eleanor to be out of touch, especially without warning. He sat down on the couch, his thoughts turning to their recent conversations. They had started to share more with each other, small details about their lives. Eleanor had even told him, in a rare moment of honesty, about the losses she had faced, about the family members who had betrayed her, the trust she had lost, and the years she had spent building her empire from nothing. Mark had been moved by her words, though he never admitted it out loud. The distance between them had closed, but it still felt fragile, as though one wrong move could unravel everything. After what seemed like an eternity, Eleanor finally responded to his text. "I'm at the office. I'll be back later," she wrote. Mark tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't. Eleanor had always been in control, always the one who called the shots. But today, there was something in her voice, something that hinted at vulnerability. He couldn't ignore it. Later that evening, Eleanor returned home, looking more exhausted than usual. She dropped her briefcase on the floor by the door and leaned against it for a moment, as if the weight of the world had just hit her all at once. Mark looked up from his book, concerned. He stood and walked over to her. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with genuine worry. Eleanor gave a tired smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just another day in the life of a businesswoman," she said, her tone dismissive, as though she were trying to brush off his concern. But Mark could see through it. He stepped closer. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eleanor. If something's wrong, you can talk about it." Eleanor looked at him, her gaze softening. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she sighed and sat down on the couch, patting the seat beside her for him to join. Mark sat down, still unsure of what was happening, but wanting to be there for her. I don't know anymore," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "It's all becoming too much. The pressure, the constant expectations, the people who only want something from me. I thought I could handle it all, but I'm beginning to feel like I'm losing control." She paused, her hands resting in her lap. "I built all of this, Mark. But sometimes, I wonder if it was worth it." Mark sat quietly for a moment, processing her words. He had seen Eleanor as the epitome of strength and control. But now, he was seeing her as a person who was just as vulnerable as anyone else, someone who had sacrificed so much to get where she was, only to find that her success had come with a price. A price she wasn't sure she was willing to pay anymore. He reached over, gently placing his hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, but it seemed to speak volumes. "You're not alone in this," he said softly. "I know we're not a typical couple, but I'm here for you. I've been here from the start, and I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you, Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the night wore on, they sat together in silence, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Mark could feel the shift in their relationship, a shift that went beyond the contract they had signed. They were no longer just two people playing a role, they were starting to understand each other in ways they hadn't before. In that moment, Mark realized something. He didn't just want the financial security that came with his arrangement with Eleanor. He wanted to be there for her, to help her through the struggles she faced, just as she had helped him in his own way. They might not have been a traditional couple, but there was something real starting to take root between them. It was then that Eleanor stood up, brushing herself off. She seemed more composed now, though the vulnerability was still there, just beneath the surface. "I'm going to bed," she said softly. "Good night, Mark." Mark nodded, watching as she left the room. For the first time since signing the contract, he didn't feel like a stranger in her life. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever happened, he would face it by her side. The following days felt different. There was a new understanding between Mark and Eleanor, something unspoken but real. Their conversations were no longer just about business or the terms of their arrangement. They began to talk more openly, sharing moments that felt less like a transaction and more like a real connection. But even with this shift, something still held them apart. Eleanor was still the guarded, powerful woman who had built her empire from the ground up. Mark, though no longer just a man bound by a contract, still felt like an outsider in her world. It wasn't enough yet, but he could feel a coming change was on the horizon. One evening, as Mark sat in the living room of their penthouse, Eleanor entered, looking more tired than usual. Her shoulders slumped as she set her briefcase down on the counter. Mark had noticed the weight she carried, the exhaustion from a life spent constantly striving for more. He had been trying to be more patient, to give her space, but tonight something in the way she entered the room told him it was time to address what had been building between them. "Eleanor," Mark said, his voice soft but firm, "what's going on? You've been distant again. We've been through a lot together, and I can tell something's bothering you." Eleanor looked at him, her expression hardening for a moment before she let out a deep sigh. She sat down on the couch beside him, and for a long while, she said nothing. Mark didn't push her, letting the silence stretch until she was ready to speak. "I'm just tired, Mark," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tired of pretending that everything is perfect. I've spent so many years building this life, but sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it. I have everything I could ever want, yet I feel empty inside." Mark turned toward her, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch hers. Eleanor didn't pull away. Instead, she let him hold her hand, the small act of kindness making the weight of her words feel just a little less heavy. "You don't have to carry everything alone, Eleanor," Mark said quietly. "I may not understand your world completely, but I know that being constantly on the edge fighting for control and power must be exhausting. But it's okay to let go sometimes. It's okay to let people in." She looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps? Or maybe it was relief. She hadn't let anyone close for so long, not in the way Mark had begun to. But he wasn't just there because of the contract anymore. He was there because, somehow, he had become someone she could trust. Someone she could depend on. "I don't know how to do that," Eleanor admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I've spent so long shutting everyone out that now, when someone actually tries to get close, I don't know what to do. I'm afraid I'll ruin everything." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm afraid I'm not capable of love." Mark squeezed her hand gently. "Love isn't something you can just control," he said, his voice warm and steady. "It doesn't follow a set of rules. You can't force it, but you also can't shut it up completely. It takes time, but it starts with trusting yourself, and then trusting the people around you. You don't have to be perfect, Eleanor. None of us are." For a long time, there was silence again, but this time, it was different. It was comfortable, like two people who had finally broken through the walls they had built around themselves. Eleanor rested her head against Mark's shoulder, her breath slowing as if the weight of the world had lightened just a little. "I never thought I'd be able to open up like this," she said quietly, her voice muffled by his shirt. "But with you, it feels easier." Mark's heart swelled at her words. He wasn't sure where their relationship was headed, but in that moment, he knew that he wasn't just here for the contract anymore. He was here for her. And he wanted to be there for her, not just as a placeholder, but as someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Mark said softly, "but I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. We're in this together, Eleanor. No matter what happens." She nodded slowly, her eyes closing for a moment as if she was allowing herself to believe him. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close to it. Something real. As they sat together in the quiet of the penthouse, Mark felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for months. They still had a long way to go. His arrangement was far from over, and there were still a lot of questions left unanswered, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Mark didn't feel alone. And neither did Eleanor. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to Mark and Eleanor's lives. They had settled into a routine, but this time, it felt different. They shared moments of quiet understanding, unspoken words, and small gestures that made the air between them feel warmer, less tense. Though their marriage was still an arrangement on paper, something deeper was starting to grow. Eleanor had started to open up more, letting Mark in slowly but surely. She was still a woman of power and control, but now, Mark was starting to see glimpses of vulnerability that made her human in his eyes. One evening, as Mark sat in the living room reading, Eleanor entered, looking a bit more restless than usual. She had been working late again, something that had become a frequent habit lately. The weight of her responsibilities was wearing on her, and Mark could see it in the dark circles under her eyes, in the way she carried herself, more tired, more withdrawn. For a moment, she didn't say anything, simply standing at the doorway, looking out the window at the city skyline. Mark closed his book and looked up at her, his concern evident. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the silence. Eleanor didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked over to the window, her back turned to him. She seemed lost in thought, the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. Mark could feel the tension building, as if something was just on the verge of spilling over. "I'm fine," she finally replied, her voice distant, but Mark could hear the strain beneath her words. Mark stood and walked over to her, standing a few feet away. "You don't look fine. You've been working non-stop. I can't keep pretending I don't see how much this is taking out of you." Eleanor's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn to face him. She stared out at the city lights, as if searching for something in the distance. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mark," she said, her tone almost resigned. "I built this empire from nothing, and now it feels like it's slipping away, no matter how hard I try to keep everything together. I thought I could handle it, but sometimes it feels like it's all too much." Mark stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You don't have to do it all alone, Eleanor. You've been carrying this for so long, but you don't have to do it by yourself anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." At his words, Eleanor finally turned to face him. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else there too, an uncertainty, a crack in the armor she had so carefully built. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but stopped herself, taking a slow breath instead. "I don't know how to let go, Mark," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've spent so many years keeping people at arm's length, I don't know what it feels like to truly rely on someone else." Mark could see the vulnerability in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt the weight of her struggle in a way that wasn't just about the business, but about the woman beneath it all. "You don't have to do it all on your own," he said again, his voice full of conviction. "You can let go with me. I don't want you to carry everything. Not anymore." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. The silence between them stretched, filled with the weight of her thoughts. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Maybe I'm just afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of needing someone and being let down. Afraid of losing control. But with you, Mark, I feel like maybe it's okay to let go a little." Mark's heart softened at her words. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something that neither of them had expected when they had first signed the contract. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch tender and reassuring. "You don't have to be afraid, Eleanor," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. And I won't let you go through this alone." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something other than the pressure of her world. She allowed herself to trust, just a little. As they stood there together, Mark felt the weight of their connection in a way he hadn't before. It was still complicated, still uncertain, but it was real. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Mark woke up to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the windows. It was one of those days when the world outside seemed muffled, quiet, as if it were holding its breath. He had slept better than he had in weeks, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Eleanor still asleep beside him. Her face, relaxed in sleep, was a stark contrast to the woman he had come to know, the driven, calculating businesswoman who rarely let anyone see beneath the surface. But now, in this moment, he saw the woman who was vulnerable, the one who had opened up to him, even if just a little. He quietly got out of bed, careful not to disturb her, and walked to the window, looking out at the city as the rain continued to fall. He thought about everything that had happened since he signed the contract. It wasn't just about financial security anymore. It wasn't about the luxury or the fancy gala invitations. He was beginning to realize that what he had with Eleanor was more than a business deal. It was real. There was something in her that he hadn't expected to find, something raw and honest that he hadn't seen in anyone else. He had come into this arrangement thinking it would be temporary, something to help him get back on his feet. But now, he was unsure of where it was headed. Was he falling for her? And if so, could he handle the complications of their lives together? As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, Eleanor stirred beside him. Her eyes opened slowly, and she looked at him, her expression soft, as though she hadn't quite woken up yet. But when she saw him standing by the window, she pushed herself up and sat, rubbing her eyes. "Mark," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. He turned to her, offering a small smile. "Good morning," he said softly. "I didn't mean to wake you." Eleanor blinked a few times, her gaze flicking to the window before she finally spoke. "It's a beautiful morning," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Despite the rain." Mark nodded, but something about the way she spoke caught his attention. There was a weariness in her voice, something that made him pause. "Are you okay?" he asked, his concern surfacing again. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, looking out the window, her fingers absently twisting the blanket. After a moment, Eleanor sighed deeply. "I'm just tired, Mark," she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I feel like I'm running in circles. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, it feels like it's slipping away. I thought I could handle it all, but lately, I'm not so sure. I don't know what's left of me anymore." She paused, her eyes reflecting a sadness that Mark had never seen before. Mark walked over to her, kneeling down beside the bed. He gently placed his hand on hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've built all of this by yourself, but you don't have to carry it all on your own. Let me be here for you." Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at him. For a long moment, she said nothing, just holding his gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I don't know how to let someone in," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been on my own for so long, I don't know if I can trust anyone. But with you, it's different. Maybe I'm ready to try." She let out a small laugh, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "It's just hard to believe that someone would want to be with me for more than just what I can offer." She paused. "But you're here, and you're not leaving. And for that, I'm grateful." She looked down at their hands, intertwined, and then back up at him. Mark's heart swelled at her words. He didn't know how to respond, but he knew one thing for Cherie was in this for her. Not for the money, not for the luxury. He had come to care for her in a way that went beyond anything he had expected. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "And I'm not with you because of what you can offer. I'm here because I want to be." He squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. We can figure this out together." Eleanor smiled at him, the expression softer than anything Mark had ever seen from her. She leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you, Mark," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. "I don't deserve this, but I'm starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I can have more than just a contract. Maybe we can have something real." Mark kissed her forehead gently, holding her close. The weight of everything that had happened between them seemed to lift, replaced by something new, something fragile, yet beautiful. As they sat there, in the quiet of the penthouse, Mark felt for the first time that what they had wasn't just an arrangement. It was the beginning of something more. And whatever the future held, he was ready to face it with Eleanor by his side. Days turned into weeks, and Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to grow. What had started as a business arrangement, cold and calculated, had slowly blossomed into something deeper, something neither of them had expected. The emotional walls they had each built around themselves had started to crumble, piece by piece, until all that was left was raw, vulnerable truth. They spent more time together, not just as husband and wife by contract, but as two people who genuinely cared for one another. They shared late-night talks, quiet mornings, and moments of laughter that Mark hadn't thought he would ever experience in a life that had once seemed so empty. One afternoon, as Mark was in the kitchen preparing coffee, Eleanor walked in, looking more radiant than usual. She had just returned from a meeting, but there was a lightness in her step, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. Mark turned to her, surprised at the change. She looked at him, her eyes shining. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice soft but full of excitement. I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I think I'm ready. I'm ready to make some changes. Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Changes? He asked, setting down the coffee pot. Eleanor nodded and walked over to him, her hands gently resting on his. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. Yes, she said. I've been running away from this for so long, but I've realized something. I've been so focused on my career, on building everything on my own, that I forgot what it feels like to just live. I've been afraid of depending on anyone, afraid of being vulnerable, but with you, I feel like I can be myself. I want more than this business arrangement, more than what we've had. I want a real marriage, Mark. A real future. Mark's heart swelled at her words, his chest tightening with emotion. For the first time since he had signed the contract, he realized that they had both been giving something more than they had expected. He had been afraid, too afraid of what this could mean, afraid of letting someone in. But now, he saw that it wasn't just a contract binding them together, it was love, even if they hadn't called it that yet. I want that too, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm in this for more than just the arrangement, Eleanor. I want to build a life with you, a real one. Whatever that looks like. As they stood there, hands intertwined, Eleanor leaned in and kissed him softly. The kiss was slow, tender, full of all the emotions they had kept hidden for so long. It was a promise, a vow to each other, one they hadn't spoken aloud but felt in their hearts. The weeks that followed were filled with changes. Eleanor began to shift her focus, letting go of some of the pressure that had weighed her down for so long. She made time for herself, for Mark, and for the life they were starting to build together. She started trusting the people around her, letting go of her fear of being vulnerable. Mark, too, felt more at ease. The uncertainty that had plagued him when he first arrived in Eleanor's world had melted away. He was no longer just a man trying to survive, he was part of something bigger, something real. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony of their penthouse, watching the sunset, Mark turned to Eleanor, a smile tugging at his lips. You know, he said, I never imagined this would be my life. I never thought I'd be here, with you, living this way. But I can't imagine it any other way now. Eleanor leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, looking out at the city below. I never imagined it either, she said softly. But I think we've both found something we didn't know we were looking for. Mark nodded, his arm wrapping around her. They sat in silence for a moment, comfortable in each other's presence, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, both of them felt like they had finally found home, not in the penthouse, not in the wealth, but in each other.